You've had an incredible career spanning prominent positions of leadership across academia, the clinic, biotech, big pharma, Germany, America, the full transatlantic experience. So I'd love it if you could please start with just taking us back a little bit and kind of giving us an indication as to what actually first sparked your interest in the field.
Yeah, so if I start very early, I always wanted to be a physician, as a small child even, and it's not really clear why. It's maybe despite no one in my family had anything to do with medicine, or maybe owing to, I don't know that, but I just remember when I was 6 years old, that was really what I wanted to do, and has never changed. I then really was quite committed to the academic medicine, and while also looking outside a little bit, so I had short intermezzo with strategy consulting, and was interested in other things as well, but I never really questioned academic medicine at that time. And so also pretty early chose medical oncology and hematology oncology as something I was particularly intrigued by. I don't really remember what drove that, but I know it was very consistent over the years, and I've never regretted it ever since. And I really loved academic medicine. At that time I really couldn't imagine doing something else. But I became more and more interested, which is a bit of a contradiction here, in industry. And I had the great fortune of having some friends and former colleagues who made the move a little bit earlier than me. So, I had some role models, or at least examples, right? And some insights on what it is. But of course, it's different than, experiencing it yourself. I just remember, there was a time when I was already relatively senior physician and attending, and a faculty member, and when I realized, and a trial investigator, and a basic and translational scientist, I just realized I know remarkably little about how drugs are actually developed and get to me, right? Yet those are my tools, right? Pretty much the only tools I have, because I wasn't an interventional cardiologist, right?
Yeah.
I was a hemonc and, a medical oncologist. So all we basically used was drugs, right? And kept bothering me. Well, bothering is probably not the right word, but, something that I couldn't forget about. And I was really just curious, because despite sitting on ad boards and, having collaborations with a lab and, being a trial investigator, I realized I had no idea really where the drugs are coming from. I had no idea how the regulatory, or little idea how the regulatory process was, and, how you actually make sure you, in the end, launch a drug and market it so it, reaches the prescriber and, more importantly, the patient in the end. So, and then it was a long process, because, I think the decade until then, I really spent to build a career in academic medicine, and, was very invested in this, and it was a difficult thought to even consider something else, right? And on top of it is that there, especially in Europe, there's still, this perception in academia, once you leave and go to industry, there's no way back, right? Fortunately, that's a little bit easier in the US, because I think people have realized that there's beneficial skill sets, right, that can be, earned in, inside and outside of academia. But that made it even harder, because my plan at that time, while being in the US in New York, was to go back to Europe eventually, or Germany even, and, pursue an academic career. So it took me a year pretty much to make that decision, but eventually I took it. And, and then I thought, okay, I'll try it, right? And if I don't like it, then, if I change my mind early enough, then there may still be a way back into academic medicine. But I actually never looked back. And, we did a lot of collaborations, especially in the beginning. I was probably still thinking someone from academic medicine, and an academic and a physician. But, I never really reconsidered my decision, and, was very happy with it. Ever since.
And what was the turning point where you decided to join Bayer and when you were working in academic science at that point?
I think there was no real turning point,
Yeah.
right? It wasn't that I suddenly didn't like academic medicine anymore. It was really just this curiosity, how do you develop drugs as such an important part of what we do? And that sounds a little bit, pathetic sometimes, but and it's probably not the only. I'm certainly not the only one saying that, but there's some truth to it, right? Because you have more leverage, right? If you develop a drug that can potentially help hundreds of thousands of people, even if it's tens of thousands of people or thousands of people, right? Depending on, what the indication is, the impact is large, right? And I was, very, very intrigued by that idea. And that's absolutely not to marginalize, what those practicing physicians do every day and, academic researchers and scientists do. But, there's a part of, probably more driven by my academic endeavors, right, in clinical research as well as in translational and basic research than by patient care, because patient care is something else, right? You can't scale that to the same degree. No one would expect this, right? But the part where you do things in an academic lab, almost always, at least in my mind, and many people I talk to, reaches a point where you think, oh, I want to see this applied, right?
Yeah.
And I didn't really see that in academia, right? There's attempts, and again, we shouldn't forget that lots of the innovation and what forms the basis for what we can do comes from academia. So there's obviously still a role, and it's important. But I think there's this desire to do something, that ends up being a drug or, make a real immediate difference for patients. And that's a very long shot if you're in a translational on a basic research lab. And still as the clinical researcher, you pretty far away from this, right? The full process of drug development. I think that was what drove it for me.
Could you take us through your journey from Bayer to Pires? So you made that venture into the biotech world. And then obviously you went from there to the US with Trillium and then finished off and kind of did a full circle with Pfizer. So I'd love to know what was going through your mind on those kind of chapters, if you like.
Yes, I was in the US when I started my first industry position, right? It started from being an academic at Einstein College of Medicine in New York. And I think going from Bayer to Pires, was just, again, probably driven by curiosity. I had a great time at Bayer and, we had back then there was an amazing environment, that allowed a lot of freedom to operate, right? We had a huge pipeline back then in the early development organization and, many academic collaboration. There was true dedication to science, right, in oncology and generating data. It was more driven by the fact that I was at that time really curious how biotech is, right? Because I heard these things of, you're very nimble and, what everybody hears, right? And everybody says, and some of it is true. And I just wanted to experience that. And, at that time, Pires seemed an interesting company. It was an ambitious platform technology and, active in something, in an area I was, truly interested in. I thought it was a differentiated platform. And, in the end, it's another lesson, right? Sometimes biology does, even if you do your diligence, right, and everybody works hard, sometimes biology doesn't really play out, right? But that's a different story.
Yeah, because it's interesting because when I work with biotechs or pharma companies on CMO searches, there are kind of key touch points from a resume perspective that are important. And one of the really interesting things about your profile is that they're all there. So for example, there's the fact that you're a medical oncologist. The feedback I've had also is that candidates who within academia go on to do further studies, i.e. your lab experience and basic research at the Albert Einstein Institute in New York means that you've kind of gone out of your comfort zone to further study. And then when you combine that with the fact that you'd worked in a transatlantic setting really for most of your career, it's something which is sought after, because quite often we find that for example, with Pirish, for example, is a German biotech, they were on a journey to establish a US presence. You were clearly at the forefront of that. Within that, you have to learn how to manage the cultural dynamics and the kind of nuances, but still working towards that ultimate business critical milestone, whether it's a filing or regulatory submission or something of that nature. So how did you find that transatlantic challenge, if you like?
Yeah, I think in many ways cultures are different, right? The way people work, and I wouldn't say what drives them, that is probably hopefully quite similar, but and I think the value system is also a big word, right? I think that is not materially different, but it's a different perspective in some ways, right? Mostly on how you work, right, and the circumstances there. And, sometimes, if biotechs, for example, build, a U.S. presence that oftentimes meet with roots in Europe, it often means that, there's an enrichment of leadership in the U.S., right? And, they often if they're public, are they NASDAQ listed? So there's a perception, of course, and maybe rightfully so, that you kind of, leave your roots behind, right? And suddenly, the balance is more on the US side, or you're gravitating a lot more and more. There's more importance in the US part, right? And sometimes that's true, sometimes it isn't. But I think it's important to obviously manage this, right? Because, especially if companies developed out of Europe, the scientists who, of course, rightfully so, have the perception that everything they did kind of, brought you where you are, right? And then you kind of moving away your focus from that. And I think that just needs some, attention and also understanding of these concerns or perceptions, at least, people have.
And when you look back on your career to date, are there key accomplishments or achievements which you look back on and think, oh, I'm really proud of that? Or what things would stand out in that regard?
Yeah, I think every drug in particular, right, which, we developed to, in the end, be given to patients, right, of course. And sometimes, you work on drugs where, they have not yet or not reached patients and, haven't had a marketing authorization or similar, but, it's still, a mode of action or a modality or a target where it's of relevance, and sometimes others have gone with it, right? And there's certainly some examples going back to my time at Bayer, where the company may not have pursued those, but others went with it, right? I think those are these particular moments, which don't mean only get a drug to approval and marketing matters, right? I think there's also, scientific insights. I'm also really proud of, some of the things that failed, right? Or, there were ideas of, and big hopes, which modalities could work, right? Or which targets could work. And then, you learn this, right? I think those are, in many ways, if you, look from a scientific perspective, important accomplishments as well. Right. And we should see that. Of course, in the end, this is a for-profit, of course, right? And success matters more than failure. I'm not naive about that. But I think, I see some of because we remain physicians and scientists after all, I see also the answers as valuable, but that of course we need to look at somewhat disconnected from the commercial success, which ultimately matters to the industry, of course.
Yeah, and it's interesting that one of the consistent themes is the kind of scientific curiosity, which clearly has led you to the combined with the entrepreneurial approach to risk, which are also kind of bedrocks of the phenotypes of the candidates that are successful, I find, in biotech. because they want to be able to make an impact, be close to the science. They thrive in that environment, but they can manage an acceptable level of risk. Not to say you don't get those things in a larger pharma setting for sure, but it's just a different dynamic, isn't it?
Yeah, no, totally agree. I mean, the typical biotech doesn't have, or at least not a big portfolio effect, right? So, oftentimes you're all in with one or two or three programs, one often in the lead. And I think you need the willingness to take risk, right? And, also be able to tolerate risk and, really the desire to make a difference for patients, right? I mean, it's obviously something that drives people in big pharma as well in the same way, of course, right? But that's the motivation, the overarching motivation, right? The scientific curiosity, of course, but, first and foremost, what you can do for patients, right? And how this can change the prognosis maybe and the outcome for patients. But separate from that is your individual risk tolerance, right? And I think, as you said very well, I mean, it's not much to add here. That it probably is a little bit higher if you're, especially if you work in a single asset company.
Yeah, that's true. Because when we evaluate biotech prospects and help them articulate their value proposition to the candidates, we have to dial in to consistent key themes which the candidates need to understand. So typically they will always want to double down on the scientific proposition, how it's a differentiator, the leadership team in place, and not just within their specific field, but in general, because you've got to buy into it, haven't you, and be inspired by and learn and developed by these people. And the funding runway's got to be, realistically long enough to achieve whatever goal that is, at whatever point you are in that life cycle. When it comes to drug development, so with the benefit of hindsight, which a lot of people don't necessarily have, working in these different environments, whether it's an early stage biotech like Pyrrhus or a later stage biotech like Trillium, or a big pharma like Bayer in the US at the early stages of your career, through to Pfizer, where you had more of a strategic role within development. With the benefit of hindsight for that, what are the top three things that you feel separates good drug development from great drug development?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't know if I really, have the top three, but I can tell you three, at least, that I think are important. I think the one thing is, really focus on execution, because that's important, right? And if you want to call it strategy, that's maybe too big a word, I don't know, but we need to think about how we position the drug and how do you develop it, what the regulatory path is. But in the end, the execution needs to be excellent, and that's probably 90% of the effort, right? And this means be very close to the sites, right? Be very close to the patients, manage the timelines, right? Because, time matters. It sounds, very obvious, but, oftentimes it's not, because these slip, right? And I think it's attention to detail, because drug development really is about attention to detail.
Yeah, I can imagine that, actually.
And who doesn't like that, right? I think there's other things than clinical development. But if you don't enjoy, to go from the big picture to really the detail, essentially, then that may not be the best, area to pursue, right? And again, there's many other things where I think if you're, really a visionary who doesn't like to deal with the actual execution, then, I'm sure there's exciting roles as well, right? Or, if you don't like the big picture, but really like to, just, deal with details or very narrow defined area, then, there may be a role for you, but it's probably not a leadership role necessarily, right? I think that's, it's not that the one is better than the other, right? It's really about what you choose. And I think the other one is really also realizing when something doesn't work, right? I think we it's this balance between the persistence of bringing something forward, right, which we absolutely need. I think that's also what biotech sets apart, because oftentimes your only chance is to win, right? And be persistent even if the situation doesn't look too promising at a snapshot in time. You also, pharma clearly is better due to at that, due to the portfolio effect. So need to let things go, right? If you manage it well, and that's of course harder if you have one asset, right? But there's oftentimes still an alternative. So I think it's really this balance between the persistence and the drive, and being able to tolerate frustrations, but also keep an eye on, when things are obviously not working, and when this pivot point comes, right? And not just keep going if, it's against all odds, essentially. I think that's important.
Now that's a really good observation. Are there when things aren't going in the way that the direction it needs to go, and effectively you've got to pull plug on a program which everyone in the whole company is super bought into, and are there certain key hallmarks where you just think, to make that informed decision, to take the emotion out of that decision, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, there are, right, I think the inflection points that you define beforehand, I mean, is somewhat fluid, right? Because is there anything, I think oftentimes, if something doesn't have a therapeutic window, for example, then, and that's a, very, very simple example, but, there's certainly more complicated situations. But then, I think you can probably try a lot of things, but, what's the likelihood of succeeding with us, right? And having said that, of course, may still be a chance to combine, right? Use a lower dose. These are more complicated situations here. Again, that's, an easier decision if you have alternatives. But examples like this, right? But I think it will tell you. And also the other thing I forgot to mention is really watching the therapeutic landscape very carefully as you do this, right? Because sometimes, and I made the mistake for sure in the past, you're so focused on developing your molecule, right, and your program or your programs, and you fight for execution and every little milestone, but you sometimes forget to watch carefully. Because in a biotech, you do a lot of this, right? You do pretty much everything depending on the size of or your colleagues do. Sometimes you're maybe not watching, the development of the therapeutic landscape, your competitive landscape carefully enough, right? And then suddenly you have a drug that works, but, there's another one out there that brings more value for patients and, maybe more convenience even on top of that, right? And then it's kind of pointless to do that. Again, sometimes, it pushes you, a line of treatment back, and it gives additional opportunities for patients, maybe, no commercial reward opportunity for patients, but that's not always the case, right? Especially if, targets are similar. So I think that's really an important thing to keep in mind, and, it's often forgotten. And of course, it's easier if you have the infrastructure internally to watch this, right? You have colleagues who you're really focusing on watching this and alerting you, but, you need to be prepared for situations where you do this as well, at least in part, right? And I think that's another important piece here.
It really speaks to the observation with your industry and your sector. I've always felt that there is such a small margin for error when compared to other industries. And when you combine that with the fact that I listen to lots of business-based podcasts about how to, improve things, build high-performance teams. And one of the key themes of all of these, failure is the pathway to success. Being able to make a mistake and learn from it is key. And when I apply that concept to your sector, I've always felt that it's like a tightrope that you have to balance, because ultimately you've got regulatory hurdles, which are hugely important, a funding runway to manage to the best of your abilities, and most importantly, the ultimate health of the patients at whatever stage of the trials that you're at. So when you consider those three things, combine that with having to learn from your mistakes, it's a tricky business, right? And I wondered how you, if there's any comments you've got around how you've overcome or managed that tightrope.
Yeah, again, a very good question. I'm not sure, I have a very complete answer here. I think you need to think about all of those areas that you described early on, right? I think, and it's an obvious comment, but, I'm really became a firm believer over some successes and even more failures over the years, to know that when you start a program and, probably even at a preclinical stage, right, like an IND enabling stage, not just when you decide to pursue registrational trials or even after that, you need to have a clear view on all of those. Right. And, the regulatory part. So what's going to be your path? Again, the therapeutic landscape, and less about competition because that's a commercial term. But, I think the therapeutic landscape, right, where do you bring value for patients and in the end, the stakeholders of the company as well, indication selection is part of this, right? And then, and again, the execution and, the way you decide to develop it with and without the regulatory path in mind. And I think all of this can change over time, likely will change because the parameters change, right? And, you oftentimes don't control those. But you should have a pretty clear idea when you get started, not in the middle of the effort, right? And I think that avoids a lot of disappointment and unnecessary effort and unnecessary spend of resources, and most importantly, also unnecessary enrollment of patients, potentially subject to a drug that never, or a candidate that never becomes an actual drug, right? So it's nothing particularly smart here, right? It applies in many other situations outside of drug development as well. I think, the message really is have a plan, and a comprehensive one and a complete one before you even get started, right? And the plan can change as, the situation and, the environment changes, but hopefully it holds at least to, a large degree.
So it's kind of a case of ensuring that everything is really well thought through with the end goal in mind from the offset, and with a pragmatic awareness of the potential obstacles. So you're kind of, which is hard, right? Especially when you consider the average drug development life cycle is 7 to 14 years, depending on what you're doing. That's a long time to think ahead, isn't it? So
that's right.
I find it fascinating how you have to be smart enough. You effectively have to have a crystal ball, because, within that, anything can happen on a geopolitical scale. So I just find it incredible that you were able to, you guys are able to do that, really, in many respects, whilst managing up to key stakeholders, investors, etc. It's fascinating. With competition and innovation becoming ever more difficult, are there any words of wisdom around how you can, or what questions you have to ask of the asset or of your approach to trying to identify a differentiator for your target or asset?
Yeah, I think, what you ask of the asset, I assume in a trial setting, or even when you characterize it before, are the kind of the hallmarks, I think, right? It's efficacy in oncology, I still think trumps most, right? Other factors, but then, of course, safety matters, almost as much. Tolerability is important, right? But, we're talking about malignant disease here. So I think it's a trade-off that eventually the patient has to decide, right? If efficacy, matters more than tolerability and what you're able to or willing to tolerate, right? But that's obviously something that a trial more than anything will give you. And I think, fortunately, we've seen over the last decade or so really more efforts in patient-reported outcomes, which, I think is important to see, even though sometimes not that easy to evaluate in clinical trials and some of the settings, but that's really an important development. And the other thing is translational, right? So, in some phases of the trial where you're not necessarily able to, estimate at least efficacy, right, in a very defined group. You get an estimate of safety and tolerability, but not necessarily efficacy. And sometimes there's chance really to see if you at least, hit the target and, there's the mechanism you were expecting to be, right? So that's another important piece to me.
Yeah, I can imagine. And is there, in your career, was there a kind of was it one or two moments where you thought, that was a misjudgment or an error on my part and something I can really learn from?
Yeah, many, I think, or many, or some, right? So, I mean, I think all of them in some ways, right? So, I mean, as I already mentioned, certainly made the mistake of focusing so much on a program and with some excitement about its efficacy and all the other features, and not necessarily having in sight how the therapeutic landscape develops, and where this leaves the value of this, right, for patients and beyond. That's one for sure. Sometimes maybe not seeing a safety signal early enough, or underestimating it. That's one, right? Or seeing some signals of efficacy, and that goes a little bit more in the direction again of the therapeutic landscape and what other drugs can do, right? Or overestimating what it will be, and continuing with development, or sometimes also relying on translational data where I think we not always have the chance to look at the cells or particular areas of interest. And one example is if you look at immuno-oncology, and for years people, including myself, right, looked at number of T cells in the tumor, and then if the number went up, then we all thought, fantastic, that's a sign of efficacy, without looking at what kind of T cells are these, right? And it's, I know it's hard. And until this day, it's hard to do that, right? Or, sometimes impossible. Are they specific, right, for against the tumor cell? We don't know that. It could be any T cell, right? That, there's assumptions, right, and approximations, and sometimes these are fine, and sometimes they're misleading.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's where you lean on your experience to make those informed decisions. Tips for biotechs on optimizing their chances and putting themselves in a better position to successfully fundraise, I suppose.
Well, I think that's a difficult question, and I think there's probably people who are better qualified than me to address that. I think my experience from both sides, right, not having been on the investor side actually, but there's different ways of financing and raising capital, right? Some is through partnerships with big pharma partners, right? And
focusing on that then, maybe, so leaning on perhaps your experience with Pfizer and working with smaller companies periodically, what advice have you got for would you have for founders of biotechs looking to position themselves optimally for fundraising purposes?
Yeah, in more general terms, obviously not at liberty to, talk about Pfizer's strategy, nor do I know it as we speak. But I think in general terms, I would say it helps, right? And we come full circle to what I said at the beginning and the middle of, our discussion here. It's good to present to a partner, and that's true for venture capitalists and private equity as well, right? Even if you're in an early stage program, talking mostly clinical stage or close to clinical stage companies, right? I less experience with very early kind of discovery stage. And I think, that's a different also investor profile probably there, and, a different branch of big pharma investors than I necessarily interacted with. But I think what's important to lay out the full path, right? Similar to what I said before for any kind of drug development, I think it's good, to show that you have thought through not just your IND or the preclinical pharmacology characterization of your molecule or drug candidate, but actually, how you're going to develop it, how long it's going to take, and for whom, right? Which patient, which disease indication, right? And you'll be surprised that, there's a lot of companies pitch who don't talk about this, right? And
Really?
if you ask, then, it doesn't necessarily make the impression they thought this through completely, right? And that's not, I'm not here to blame anyone, certainly not, my place by any means. But I think it's just important, right? Advice, because I've seen it from the other side as well. And, that certainly doesn't give investors slash partners a lot of confidence, right? If you haven't done that, there are companies, some of who I've advised in the past or still advising, who actually very early stage, but they think all of this through, right? And I think that this will actually, make a true difference. And the other thing is, of course, right, and that's more obvious, you need the more clinical data you have, right, and the more clarity you have, the easier that is for investors and partners to decide, right? And I certainly can't cover all of big pharma here, right? My experience is very limited. And even for those I worked at, I couldn't comment on their general strategy as it is right now. But, my perception is there is a trend, certainly a trend, to requiring more mature clinical data for an investment decision, right? Which sometimes happened, a couple of cohorts and a few responders on the dose escalation trial now requires a lot more, right? It's also harder, I think, for combinations in single arm trials. And, while this is, expensive and, it might not be possible, so it's not sure about the value of the advice or if it's even meant as an advice. But I think my takeaway, and haven't always honored it myself, but, if you have an early or mid-stage program, which, you start to work on in combinations, I would always consider, if you can afford it, it's feasible, a two-armed, a trial at least with, a control arm, so you can actually show what you deliver on top of it. And it doesn't need to be based on, extensive statistics. It can be, probably even descriptive in some ways, but it just gives more confidence, right? Gives more confidence to partners and to investors. But, it is at a time where capital is, is scarce, or access to capital is hard, right? And that's, of course, a tall order. It's like, okay, well, now you don't present your 20 patients in a single arm trial, even if it's a combination. You actually present data where you compare those, with a combination partner, which kind of doubles the number of patients roughly, right? Or so, but that would be, I think, I'm not sure how helpful this is, but
No, it is interesting. It is interesting. What about when you're actually communicating with investors? Because they're not necessarily, sometimes they are, but they're not necessarily from a scientific or medical background or from an industry background perspective. They may, and so sometimes the way that you articulate yourself needs to be themed differently. Have you got any insights around how you communicate with in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, I need to say, I've mostly really interacted with extremely educated investors and analysts who certainly know all the details and understand the details, and I enjoy these conversations because they really often ask smart questions ask questions you haven't even thought about.
Yeah.
And, it's true. And I hope the generalists are going to come back, right? So, I mean, these are also, usually extraordinarily smart people, but of course they cover a lot of ground, right? And if you, invest in, totally different industries, of course you cannot necessarily have the same depth and context, right? But they really very fast to analyze things and pick it up. But there, I think you really need to make sure you don't get lost in detail, right? And you really carve out the key messages here. It's even more so, I think, with those really specialized investors in certainly healthcare, even oncology. You often present it the way you would present it internally. But I think with the generalists, and again, I hope they're gonna enter the biotech market again soon, because really need it, right? Their support. And, there you probably want to provide a little bit more context and make it a little bit more streamlined for them, because, these are really people who cover a lot of ground, right? And, jumping from, an IT topic to biotech, right? And I think that they need a little bit more streamlined messaging.
And you mentioned that they can ask really good, insightful questions, which will get you thinking, which is a great way to look at it. So because I suppose they're coming at it from a slightly different angle, what sort of questions would they be?
Yeah, I mean, it's really kind of all over the place, right? But they very analytical, right? And sometimes they ask truly hard questions, right? And also towards inconsistencies if there are some, right? So I can't give a really good example here, but more than once I actually thought, that actually it was a great impulse to think about it really differently, because I mean there's some some kind of blindness you develop, right, if you deal with the same thing or the same things over and over and over again. So you sometimes just not seeing certain things. And that's really why, I came really to the, where I enjoy these conversations. It wasn't, in the beginning, I think it's a little bit intimidating, right? So kind of my first C-level position, I actually, oh my God, right? What gets me, and do the answer, and what's going to happen if I don't, or given, whatever, I wouldn't say inappropriate, but not so smart answer. And this is always a bit of a stress factor. But later I really thought, okay, well, these are mostly helpful, right? And it's not that they judge you on the spot. And there's no coming back from, whatever answer you gave, right? And any mistake you made. But I found these conversations really helpful in terms of a highly educated outside perspective, right? It's just, I know it's more in general terms, but...
No, it's good. It's good because it does give an insight, because I can imagine those first few meetings where you're, looking to impress and I suppose articulate the message from the company you represent with the investment community. It's a really important one, and it's out your comfort zone, as anything is when it's the first time you do it. So like starting a podcast. So it's good sometimes to go out your comfort zone, isn't it? And to challenge yourself. And although they're asking you questions about something you know everything about, or you have a deep understanding of, because they're thinking about it from a different background and perspective, sometimes that takes you to that point, which is where, you learn about yourself and how to improve. And so notice that, well, in my previous role, before I worked in life sciences, from a talent perspective, I worked in the business transformation sector. So I worked with blue chip organizations, typically within the insurance and financial services and markets, big FTSE 500 companies, where I would work with them on their business transformation journey. We could utilize digitalization topics, but also things around operational excellence and processes. Now, when I compare that to that of, say, the life sciences sector, I feel like the need to build high performance teams has never really been so important.
Yeah, that's on my side. Sorry, it was an ambulance.
Oh, was it? I thought it was my side, but it sounded like almost otherworldly. So I'll start that bit again, because I actually said it the wrong way around anyway. So I meant to say, on the topic of building teams, when I compare the building of teams and the need for high-performing teams within the life sciences sector, I think it is clearly of such importance when you compare it or align it with the tight margins that we referred to earlier. So whether it's fiscal discipline, regulatory hurdles, or just making sure that, like you say, you understand the therapeutic landscape, so there could be no other hurdles that enter the market prior to there being a market for your product when it reaches commercialization, etc. So when I compare those hurdles and needs with, say, the sector that I used to working in from a talent perspective in business transformation, where I would work with FTSE 500 companies on their transformational journey within insurance, there's clear similarities in finding the very best people and the impact that they can make. But there's also, I think enormities of scale, and, the importance is almost even more important in drug development, I think, where the margins are smaller. So I'd love to hear what your kind of rules or golden rules have been around building successful teams for drug development purposes.
Yeah, I think we touched on this
Yeah.
a little bit earlier already. I think it's mindset first, right? So I think it is really important that, and more important in my mind than education or experience. Why those are important, and there's of course certainly a requirement for those. But given that these requirements have been met, I think it's really important, people to have the right mindset, right? In biotech, certainly, and there's not one size fits all, but it depends also on the team. But I think generally, really, people who are team players, right? I think it's important, and I'm certainly not the first one, and also not the last one to say that. And we probably all read it in many articles and books. But it is true that I think someone who ranks the organization, the team, the company, the program higher than their own goals, right? And their own ego is really, really important. And that's easier said than done. We all both of us probably included, right, try to kind of work on our own careers and, have our own goals. And it's always also, I heard a couple of times, if you do this, similar for you probably, like from like a C-level position or equivalent, right? To say like, why, care about our, endeavor here, more than about your title or your next promotion, right? And it's easily said if you're in a much different position, right? Because there's not necessarily any promotion, right, you would expect, and there's not as much pressure to develop a career. I totally see that, right? But I think it's still important, people who genuinely, and that's more important even in biotech, because let's face it, right? I mean, the development path, if you interpret this as something that's vertical, not horizontal, right? Then that's a difficult place, right? I think if your satisfaction comes, you have a bigger role, every year. Just look at the organization, right? So if, all the levels above you don't get promoted or leave, right? Both required every year, then, how can you possibly get a bigger role every day or every year? And, also some crave bigger titles, right? Something we all understand, right? But to me, a title is kind of tied to role, right? If the role doesn't change, why would the title necessarily change? And, this is all, probably not what a lot of people like to hear, but, it is a bitter matter of fact. And I think in biotech in particular, you need to interpret growth with the exposure you have, right? Increasing level of responsibilities, but not necessarily interpreted at, on a hierarchical basis, right? And, just interpreting success and development with the success of the company and your assigned program or programs, right? And, the way you improve on your skills and on your experiences, right? If this doesn't matter to you, then I think it's hard to find long-term satisfaction there. And in some ways true for pharma as well, right? Because, there, of course, development paths are a little bit easier, but, also these companies are relatively notorious for people just staying in their positions for a long time, right? And if you want to create an environment where you want to, enable these careers also, again, in a vertical way, then you need to look towards, the strategy consulting companies or investment banks, right? Where you have these upper out, coach, right? Where everybody, who can't be promoted needs to leave. And with that, you ensure a forced turnover to ensure that people are, considered capable and suitable for taking on bigger roles actually get these roles. But that's, I think, in many ways not desirable neither in biotech nor in pharma, because you want to, because you're developing them, not that, consulting firms wouldn't, but, with their employees, but it's a different business model, which, also not qualified to speak to. But I think that's important to understand. Right?
It's a win-win, isn't it? I think when an employee feels valued, they're learning, they're bought into the mission and the vision, and they're paid what they should be paid in terms of market rate, then that person, as long as they're given fresh challenges and they're not, then they'll stay for hit the milestone, because it looks good for them anyway, doesn't it? Are there kind of red flags that aren't your obvious red flags that you have kind of procured in your own mind over time from a few experiences?
Yeah, I think there are, and if you turn to talk, mean it in terms of teams, all right, and I think there's always people who don't see the team, right? People who, I mean, it's kind of the mirror image of what I, just said, but the people who, really see their own goals above everyone else's.
Yeah.
And most importantly, I think you can and should have inclusive teams, right? So, one thing I really believe in, that you almost always come to a better decision if you have a lot of different perspectives and, from people with a really different background, right? Looking at, a complicated or complex question in different ways. It is a time commitment, right? Of course it's faster to, make just all the decisions, but I really do believe in the diversity of teams and the different, again, I'm repeating myself, backgrounds and experiences, and then coming to a decision together, which doesn't mean we're kind of voting, right, and make decision by the majority vote, right, but at least hear what people have to say and take it into account. But sometimes, always true for me as well, right, you don't get it the way you think it should be done, right? And sometimes you're very convinced you're right. But I think it's important to come around, right? If the decision is different, you can't just oppose it, right? I think you can probably re-challenge it or seek in a professional way discussions and lay out your arguments again. But, if you don't get there, then let it go, right? And I think people who can't do that, they're really going to difficult and, to deal with in teams or kind of toxic relationships with, reports, peers, as well as peers, right? So that's really something I came to a zero tolerance policy, right? After, in the early days, really trying to, always try to make it work, right? And really, approach people and hope for change, right? But, I think you're doing a lot of damage to teams if you do that, right? And including yourself. So I think if there's really kind of toxic, disrespectful behaviors, don't need to describe this in more detail now, right? I think, that's really something where you need to act fast. And, those are the main red flags, I think.
Yeah, it's based on what you just said, there's a number of key highlights which you can't find in a CV, can you? You have to look outside of that. I think that's actually reflected in the way that the recruitment or human capital kind of sector's moving, actually. So when we first founded ARTO, it was more, we had a typical kind of contingent and retained search offering, which we found, and we realised quite quickly that in order for biotechs and pharma companies, etc., that we work with to make informed decisions, they needed a better insight into what was going on and what would fit their team, and how they could get better data around their cultural fit from previous roles. Naturally, you get things like reference checking, but also to benchmark against other people. So we incorporated a number of different offerings within our service. So we have like embedded talent solutions. So you would actually put people on site as representatives of ARTO to help manage the time management aspects of scheduling interviews. We use AI and data analytics that we share access to on the reports and dashboards, which are themed at the beginning of that engagement based on what they're looking for. And it's really themed and aligned with what you just said around helping them make informed decisions based on mitigating the risk of them having a red flag under their bonnet. And that's a big part, isn't it, of making those decisions. Great. Okay. So, and we're nearing the end of the podcast now, Ingmar. So I'd love to, before we finish, I was hoping to do like a quick fire round of you on some non-negotiables on leadership before we wrap this up. So if you're okay, so what I would like to start with you is, so in terms of leadership, from your experience and learnings, both in how you've been managed and how you act now as a leader, what are the 3 traits in terms of personality that you think makes a good leader?
Yeah, I think supportive, right? So be able to give employees, colleagues, reports, the feeling that they're truly valued, right? And, honestly valued and supported, right? So, even if things sometimes don't go the way they should, right? Unless this constantly happens, a good leader should have the employees back. I think that's important. Being able to tell the story, right? In terms of transparency, needless to say, there's limits, right? I mean, some of the things are confidential and you can't share with, the entire team or the entire company. But I think you can definitely share the vision, right? And something that always helped me or made it difficult for me if it wasn't there, right? If, one actually gave me the context and the rationale, the whole framework, the thinking around why we're actually doing what we're doing, right? And where we headed. So I think you need to be able and willing to spend time to share this with people. And, really great examples of leaders who were extremely good at that and others who weren't at all, right? And I think it makes a lot of difference. It might be different for different people, but, for me, that's certainly one, of the most important ones, right? You make sure people are on board, with a journey. Yeah, then I think, motivators, that's important. I kind of evolved my thinking a little, or my thinking evolved a little bit there, because I think initially you should provide a setup and a framework for people so they are motivated, but they're motivated by what they're doing, right? They motivate themselves. It's less about you go and motivate someone. I'm not entirely sure how that would look like. Right. But I think less than that, because we read this all the time. You need to be a motivator. Well, I think you need to be someone who sees what people are motivated by, right? And how you can create an environment. But, it's less you trying to motivate an individual. But, in the general context, I think that's another important skill. And you said top 3, because I think the third one I mentioned is, is important. But, obviously.
It's lower on the scale.
Like first, no, I don't think it's lower in the scale, but I think, the other thing is analytical skills, right? I really always liked leaders who were able to analyze a situation very quickly and provide some guidance, right? I think that's until this day, working with a CEO or in a bigger pharma, whatever the position would be, who can basically dissect the situation and early on has a clear path, right? Where she or he wants to go. I think that, it gives a lot of reassurance, gives still reassurance to me, right? And believing in the abilities of that person to really, lead.
And before we wrap this up, Ingmar, what is next for you? What does the future hold? You've recently left Pfizer, so and I know that you're close to accepting something. So interested to hear what your situation is.
Yeah, I see. So the future has started. I actually just took a new CMO role at a company called Zentalis. I'm very excited about, and I think it's going to be a great story, and we'll be able to, show the value of this even more so than it has been done until now, or it is right now. And, I'm actually very, very excited about this.
We've got a hot take on Leading Beyond the Lab podcast. Great. Well, thank you so much for making the time for the podcast today.
You.
It's been a pleasure chatting to you and really getting in touch with all of these key topics that are really going to provide value to the drug development world. So we've covered lots of different things there, from AI, your career, fundraising challenges, the differences, how we can bridge the gap and make life easier for scientists and physicians moving into industry. So there was a lot there. So thank you so much, and we'll no doubt speak soon.
No, it's great chatting with you as always, and like usual, we covered a lot of ground. Fantastic. Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.